Good morning, everyone. I'm Nancy Giordano, and I'm joining you here from Austin, Texas. Very, very sad that I'm not in Warsaw with you this morning. I was so looking forward to this trip and being with you all, but I'm thrilled that through the magic video, I'm able to still participate in this extraordinary event and hopefully at least be part of kicking off the conversation on the enterprise of the future. So I will share my screen and prepare, but I just want to say thank you to Beata and to Michael and to the Executive Club for inviting me to be part of this executive forum. So my work is as a strategic futurist, and I spend a lot of time helping organizations and audiences and leaders understand how the future is taking shape, right? What are the trajectories and how will technology, society, and culture merge together? And when you start to look at the future, it is, it's both exciting and a bit daunting. It's not just this little moment in time, and once we figure out, sort of the model for the future, we're all going to be set. It is a very dynamic process, and we're so early in. When you speak to the technologists or the designers or the entrepreneurs who are literally shaping the future, when we ask them how far along are we, most will say we're about 1%, which means that we're just getting a glimpse of what it is that's possible as, so many industries and society itself transforms. So as you start to approach that, you start, a bunch of questions come rolling in about whether or not your organization's prepared, your team is prepared, whether or not you've got the right investments, you've made the right partnerships, whether or not you're able to adapt fast enough, are you able to sense and respond quickly, and even individually, are you prepared for what it means to lead moving forward or to build the thing that needs to come next? So these questions swarm in often simultaneously, can be very overwhelming. So one of my primary strategies for being able to navigate the future is to remember to take a deep breath. And I invite you to do so right now, together. It feels so good. And it also is a reminder that over the last, it's been a very tumultuous several months that we've been going through, and frankly, for the last several years, with many technologies that we've already been adopting and learning more about and absorbing into our organizations. And so this is a constant process, and it's only going to get quicker. This is sort of the tricky part as we move forward. So it's important that we take a deep breath and that we also open our scope of vision. When I think about the future, I think about it through three lenses. The first is as a professional. We come to these events so that we can become better prepared for our work next week or next year. But we also are individuals who are going through this. We're humans who are going through this. This impacts our life as parents, as sons and daughters, as members of our community, and increasingly as members of society. We're asked to think about our actions, not just in the domain of our work, but also how it impacts our lives and how it impacts all of our lives. As we think about this in terms of the scale and the scope and the speed and the complexity with which it is that we are now being asked to think about these kinds of things and to consider how we move forward, I have just a very simple two-question compass. It has served me very, very well strategically over the last many years, working with all size organizations, including even my own work, which is just simply this. Do we understand what the future needs and expects of us? As we think about the enterprise of the future, what does it need and expect of us? That's the conversation we're going to have together in the next few minutes. And then it invites us to reflect on what we're in a unique position to create and contribute to that as an individual, as an organization, as an industry, even as a society or as a nation, to be quite frank. We all are bringing very unique experiences, capacities, resources, curiosities to this future. And we are all in a unique position to add and contribute to something as the future is literally taking shape before us. Here's the key. Business was already under a tremendous amount of stress prior to the pandemic. It wasn't like everything was just thriving and we all, were moving ahead in a really very confident or very stable way. Boston Consulting Group did a research study last year that showed two really crucial statistics. One was that the odds of failure are increasing. 1 out of 3 public companies in the US, they predicted would cease to exist in its current form over the next 5 years. Now, current form is a key phrase there. It doesn't mean the company would necessarily cease, but in its current way in which it delivers its services or products or creates value would become less and less relevant and would need to be reinvented. And that is a rate that's 6 times higher than it was 40 years ago. So the imperative is even more advancing and more demanding. But the second also has to do around profitability, that there was a gap between those who are at the top quartile and those who are at the bottom quartile, and that gap continues to grow and has more than doubled in the past 30 years. So again, the imperative to really rethink what it is that we do and how it is that we do it is clamoring louder and louder, and it's not going to get any simpler, right? Technology is advancing, information is growing, and culture is shifting exponentially. And exponential means different than linear. It's not something you can easily predict for and know that in 2 years it's going to look like this, 4 years it's going to look like that. The fact is, exponential often catches us off guard. We think nothing is happening, and all of a sudden, whew, the data collects and the technologies start to converge, and this, sort of the moment is right for this thing to take off. One thing that the pandemic has certainly made us more aware of is what does exponential look like, right? We go from 0 to 2 to 37 to 329 to thousands very, very quickly because the way it spreads, and that's the way that technology is shifting things as well. Which means that this is where we're in a position where old systems are breaking down and new systems have yet to be created, and it creates this gap. We describe it as the liminal gap, the space between here and there, now and next. And often it is a very daunting way to jump through. Not all companies make it through that liminal gap. So the question is, how do we create a better sense of confidence? What are the skills that one needs? What are the capacities one needs in order to be able to cross this divide with, again, an ability to be successful in it, to be able to create the innovations, to be able to create the change, to be able to look for the solutions, again, to be able to sense change and respond to change in a more effective way. And it comes down to this really simple idea of adaptive capacity. How able are we to adapt? What is our capacity to adapt? How do we cultivate that? How do we grow that? How do we nurture that? How do we incentivize that? It was a big part of this conversation as we move forward. As we have been looking at things both through the pandemic before and after, it seems as though one of the ways in which we can think again about our adaptive capacity, our ability to see what the future needs and expects of us, is to look at 4 things that are shaping the enterprise of the future. I'll take you very quickly through these, but I think that they're important to spend time and attention on. We have jumped into this en masse during the pandemic, and it's only going to continue, which is our digital reliance for work, for learning, for well-being, and play, right? Digital tools will shape our world. People describe this as the 4th industrial revolution. I'll rename it the 4th productivity revolution because we're moving to a digital future. It's not industrial anymore. It's about how productivity will be created and distributed. In the United States, we saw headlines like this, that 1.1 million school children had to quickly shift from on-site learning to remote learning. So imagine again, these organizations, the administrators and teachers and parents who had to quickly adapt to that. They were less prepared than they should have been. Many, many of us have been clamoring for years for organizations of all kinds, both public and private, to become more adaptive, to become more sustainable, to become even more humane, to think about these technologies to better prepare, not necessarily for a pandemic, but for a shift like this. So the districts or the organizations that were able to invest in this already were better prepared than those who had absolutely no experience with it at all. And as we jump in, we can certainly see where the gaps are. Not everything is perfect, right? Both in terms of how it's delivered and in terms of just features and benefits and opportunities we can see for innovation. A lot of innovation is certainly going to come out of this pandemic. But also important to recognize is when all of these technologies converge, right? Again, if we're only 1% in, and we've gotten some taste now of how important it is to understand how digital technologies will impact our lives, can we be more curious as we look ahead and imagine how artificial intelligence and virtual reality and augmented reality, mixed reality, spatial computing will impact our work and our lives? About as we have sensors and Internet of Things surrounding us and gathering more data, what does that tell us? What do we do with that? How will that impact our interfaces of human-machine interfaces? Cybersecurity, certainly increasingly important. Robotics, this idea of a distributed web or distributed ledger or blockchain, drones, 3D printing, 3D plus printing, huge advances in biotech and bioengineering that are reshaping the food industry and medicine, among many, many others. And the advancing 5G connection network, and eventually at some point quantum computing, which we barely know anything about and will be, again, a huge, huge game changer. So imagine, again, how do we build capacity to be able to become, again, more curious around these things and learn how they will be able to enhance our well-being and, frankly, some of the things that we should be worried about as we look on the horizon. I get excited about how this is already taking shape. So, if right now we're just trying to learn how to use Zoom and how to do video conferences, there are other people who've been working on some pretty exciting advances around autonomous vehicles. Right, already in Sweden, there's a truck that has no cabin and no driver and is able to transport things safely across the distance. We're certainly learning more I think autonomous trucking is for sure going to happen, and I assume autonomous vehicles as well. Across what timeline, we don't know yet, but it's in the works, as is drone delivery. Drones have been tested in various parts of the world, but now again, as we saw with the pandemic, we understand and appreciate how important it is to be able to get things from here to there safely and fast, and and by different means, and that will have impact again on how things get delivered, where they get delivered, how they're secure. But we're learning more, and we're getting more interested in what drones will be able to be as part of our distribution networks. As we, again, are working so much through video conferencing, we're recognizing, wow, there are really some limits to this. What are some things that we could do that would enhance this experience? A company called Spatial is at the front end of the virtual, or so the augmented reality side of this, in which we are able to put on certain goggles or a certain kind of equipment and be able to work in real time much more dynamically with one another. I love the way they describe it, which is the room becomes the monitor and your hands become the mouse. Like, imagine again a much more integrated and more visceral and potentially natural way, ironically, in which we would communicate and collaborate in distance but connected. Certainly artificial intelligence is going to play a huge role coming out of this. We saw that technologies that were at the forefront ended up becoming big accelerants as people came out of, or societies came out of other economic slowdowns. In the 2000s, it was the internet. People who understood that the internet was not just this weird nerdy thing over here, but thought we could build very different businesses like Amazon, certainly have been very, very successful as a result of this. And many businesses who converted and understood that Amazon would, or that the internet would be a critical player in e-commerce and everything else. In the recession in 2008, mobile and cloud computing and social media became the huge accelerants. And those who understood that were able to build companies like Uber and Airbnb and so many of the other things that came out of that generation of technology. And we believe that AI will do the same. I work for an AI company in Austin called Kung Fu AI as part of my work. It's a small portion, but they're AI services and consulting company. I helped build a company 4 or 5 years ago in AI. So I am a big proponent of this technology, and I think it will be a huge game changer for us, but it needs to be managed well. It needs to be very thoughtfully deployed and shaped. And so I'm part of hopefully building safe and ethical and trustworthy AI, but it has, again, it'll be an important part of what we build in the future that offers predictability and it offers efficiency, and we're certainly able to do things in a more equitable or sort of fast and easy way, but also it will change business models. We'll think about how our businesses are able to create value differently through artificial intelligence. So if you haven't begun your experiments with it now, I highly encourage you just to get some familiarity with this. It will be the technology that takes off. And what we'll realize is how important trust is as we build these things. We see things like the debate around facial recognition technology. IBM has decided to abandon their investments in it because there's both ethical issues and bias issues, but also how we create and build trust to get people to adopt this. Contact tracing applications were not something that any one of us, or certainly I didn't spend any time thinking about. Very few did 6 months ago, and now it's become an increasingly important part of how we manage through this pandemic. Right. So in Germany, they built it so that the data would not be collected so centralized. They would all be held in our individual devices, which gives us a lot more security. It doesn't feel as though it offers us, opportunities for surveillance. Versus Norway, who decided to build it in a more centralized way, and it did not get the adoption. And at this point, has now been abandoned. It's been halted. I don't know if they're redesigning it, but they certainly are not advancing it the way that they were. So this idea that you have to build it in a way in which people feel well held in it and feel as though they can trust, again, how we're using the data and how it serves them moving forward is an important part. So as we look again on the horizon, you start to imagine, okay, well, 5 years from now or 10 years from now, how would these technologies completely change the game? Virtual reality might become where we work. Maybe this whole idea about, where it is that we physically are will have even less relevance in a VR world. There's a real estate company here in the US that sells real estate with real people, but they do it all through virtual reality. Imagine again, like it doesn't matter where we are as long as we've got connectivity. And the same with medicine. What if it is possible that AI is a real democratizer and makes it possible that I can just go into a kiosk, I can be diagnosed through the machines that are in it, that have been informed by medical professionals, but that are diagnosed by a machine, and then have medicine immediately dispensed very safely through your kiosk that makes it possible for me to be able to get it all there in one shot. And suddenly that becomes now an ability to diagnose and deliver, at least for your everyday common illnesses, in a much more affordable, much more accessible way across the world for people who don't have the kind of access. That's the thing that excites me about technology and this digital economy that we're heading into, right? When it is deployed with people at the center and really trying to solve real problems, it has tremendous opportunity to enhance our lives. The second, though, is that we also are getting a great view of our consumptive behavior and planetary health. This idea of climate change has been, certainly, again, a big and loud conversation. We're trying to get people's attention and think about how it is that we can address this issue moving forward. And now that the pandemic hit, we got a very, very clear view of what happens when we stop doing certain things. Again, prior to the pandemic, we were saying things like 1/3 of all plant and animal species could be extinct in 50 years. If we don't address climate change. So amongst all the other reasons we should be worried about this, this certainly seems like a very important one, and a legacy I don't want to leave my children and hopeful grandchildren at some point, right? But is that the thing that really gets our attention? Or is it the fact that all of a sudden when everything closes down, we can have clean air? When we aren't flying and cars aren't on the road and manufacturing is stopped and retail has closed, like, it's amazing to see what it is that's happening to the air. Right? We can see things on the horizon that we couldn't see before. The water is clear. Animals are roaming around in different ways than they were before. So again, will that be the thing that pushes us forward? Like the fact that we can actually see very clearly that when we stop consuming in this way, right, it opens up this kind of healthy environment for us. The key is to not make it such a tug of war between economic vitality and environmental stability. How can they work in concert more? How can we be in better balance or in better symbiosis with this as we move ahead? Well, part of it is to really think as we are on the horizon and are rethinking about the future of enterprise, how can we be part of the solution? Even prior to the pandemic, a large fast casual retailer, H&M, committed to being 100% circular and 100% renewable by 2030. They know that their customers, which are young people who are very worried about climate change, are their customers, right? They're the ones who are looking at saying, I don't want things to be so disposable and have so much energy attached to everything that I purchase. I would like for it to be done in a way in which my values can be expressed more clearly. We also see municipalities that are committing to becoming now 100% renewable in their energy creation. And as wind and solar become more and more affordable, and as energy becomes more dependable and less intermittent and more storable, we're going to see this continue to grow as part of every civic plan moving forward. And we're going to see, again, the systems that encourage these kinds of purchases and encourage this kind of behavior. Here's a credit card out of Sweden that has built in a carbon calculator and a carbon limit. So again, through sensors and AI and data that comes in, it can calculate with every purchase I make what the carbon footprint of that is. And at some point, I have an allocation. If I buy an expensive plane ticket, or not expensive, but a long distance plane ticket versus something else, it will use up more of my carbon credits. And all of a sudden, at some point, my card ceases to work, right? This becomes an enabler for the kind of person I want to be on the planet, which is to help protect it. On an even broader level, you have technologies like Clarity AI. The World Economic Forum identifies each year about 100 technologies that they think are changing the planet for the good, and one of which this year was Clarity AI, which is a tech platform that analyzes the social impact of investments and organizations. Again, incentivizing them to be part of the solution, whether we're able to capture this data and analyze it, make it visible, and incentivize people to move in this direction, right, the more willing we are to do so. So then you think, okay, well, on the far edge, again, way out on the horizon, what else can we do that would be sustainable? What are ways in which we would change our businesses or our behaviors? And one interesting company is called RedGrid.io. It is out of Australia, and they're really thinking about building the internet of energy. So it's not just about the fact that it's about renewable energy, but it's about how it is generated and distributed in very different ways, not in centralized ways, certainly that we'd all be part of the grid, and also using these advancing technologies to imagine how we're actually consuming it in much more thoughtful ways, much more autonomous ways, much more fluid ways. So thinking about it from a different place about how we can think about energy as a sort of very different kind of service. And in the land of bold transformations, this is one of my favorite examples. Air Nippon Airways is thinking about how to transport its customers to destinations not in an airplane, right? But using advanced technologies like virtual reality or robotics and haptics that allow me to feel things, that make travel now open to people who either physically weren't able to travel or financially weren't able to travel, or just frankly don't want to go to trample on destinations in which too many people are traveling. So then the world opens up, which I just think, again, is such a bold experiment, and not thinking about cannibalizing their business, but thinking about how to extend their business with technology, right? But as all of these, again, come forward, it's about this balance. Now, here's an interesting one, again, that we've become very aware of, which is about addressing systemic biases and growing inequities. And these biases or these inequities are economic, they're racial, they're ethnicities, oh my gosh, and gender, right? These are all the areas in which we need to be paying much more attention and thinking about the injustices, not just of the moment, but over time, and the need for diversity and dissent, which I'll dig into. On an economic front, what we saw here again as the pandemic rolled in is just how close to the edge people are. We, again, as futurists, have been talking for years about growing inequality, economic inequality, and bipolarized economies, and that we need to address that. And what was become, again, very real is how many people were living on the edge as their jobs became so fragile, and they were either furloughed or were fired or had reductions in income, and how we can't just ignore the fact that there's a big portion of the population that needs support and needs to have it leveled out better. But we also saw that with the virus, that it wasn't hitting everyone equally. The communities of color, or those in various kinds of parts of the country, or with different health backgrounds, certainly were impacted more, but also, people who could remote work and people who couldn't remote work, people who had reliable broadband internet at home and who didn't, people who had reliable healthcare and who didn't, who had accessibility to fresh and clean air, to be quite honest, has become a contributor to this. So as someone described it recently, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. What we're seeing now is the differences in our boats and our ability to hopefully address that more successfully. And then in the middle, of all of this is another big, huge wave of awakening and awareness had to do with social justice. Certainly in the United States, this conversation of not just the fact that there is an economic inequality that's been taking shape over the last, 10 or 20 years, but that this is actually a systemic bias that has been part of our economy since it was founded over 200 years ago. When you think about gender inequality, it's thousands of years, which has been built in, and these biases are part of our system. So how do we open up and think about this again in a much more compassionate, much more informed way, both again in the US and around the world, and build systems that are more just? Well, as we start to imagine moving out of this, what opportunity does this create for us? What does this awakening make possible? And the first is the potential of creating more affordable cities. Now that we see, again, the income divide and we see the resources that are necessary, how do we build more affordable cities? And also, again, how does work shape that differently? If I don't have to work in an office in an expensive city anymore, I can live anywhere and still do this kind of work. And as a company, I can hire from anywhere in which the talent is. So I think there will hopefully be a more equitable distribution of work and livability and affordability as a result of this pandemic. We're also coming to appreciate again, over and over again, how important it is that we have diversity, both in our boards and our senior leadership, inside our organizations at all levels. The research is clear. Again, we've been talking about this for years. Performance is boosted, innovation is higher. Companies are more resilient that have this kind of broader perspective. Any monoculture of any type is going to create bias. There's no way around it. You can't see around all the corners, but the more that you have people with different perspectives, again, across ethnicity, across race, across gender, across age, across kinds of backgrounds that people have, the more well-rounded we are and able to build solutions, and the stronger our organizations and our companies become. It's incredibly important when you apply that then to a world that is run boldly with artificial intelligence. I won't say by, but in collaboration with artificial intelligence, because the way in which we root out bias is that we have a broader group of people who are building these solutions and thinking about the data that we're using and thinking about the algorithms and how they're applied, and thinking about, again, if they're treating everyone equitably as that data is collected and used and analyzed and put into action. So again, diversity becomes a big part, but interestingly, it's not just about having diverse teams, it's also about having room for dissent, being able to challenge each other's opinions, being able to call each other out on things, and being able to have more open conversations. You don't want a group of diverse people who are still all thinking the same, right? You want them to be able to be safe and feel supported in bringing up challenging conversations. Which leads us to this fourth big thing that is shaping the enterprise of the future, which is a deeper understanding of ourselves, our own capacities, our support networks, and the systems that hold us. Certainly the pandemic has made very visible, right, sort of how we handle change individually, how we feel supported in our homes, how we feel supported in our communities, with our employers, and with society at large. Our governments really have our back. Like, who can we rely on as we take on so much change and try and navigate through that? You know, again, on an individual level, there's been, fortunately, a tremendous amount of opportunity or visibility into mental health and well-being. Prior to the pandemic, we knew this was an issue. We had growing rates of anxiety, depression, and even suicide amongst our youngest populations, which is, I mean, just heartbreaking and a giant flaw in our ability to manage things as a society. So the good news is, although anxiety levels, I think, are increasing during this, we're actually much more aware of it, certainly reaching out to people more, building solutions for it more. I thought it was fascinating that American Express, a credit card and financial services company, gave all of their customers access to a meditation app called Calm. This is not a healthcare company. This is my financial company, wanting to make sure that I felt well held and was taking deep breaths often in order to build my own resilience, right? In order to build my ability to cope around this. So we're spending a lot more time thinking about that and talking about that actively. And again, we're looking at the organizations around us, what, you know, companies are doing to hold people well. You know, Microsoft was lauded very much for being at the forefront of saying hourly workers will still, you know, be getting a paycheck even if they're not coming to the campus to work in the cafeteria or in janitorial services. But also this very controversial conversation about full-time employees versus independent contractors, and are they getting the same kind of benefits? And then overall, how are companies sort of using their resources in a way to be part of the solution, even if it's not directly, right? How are they building, you know, or producing and donating personal protective equipment, and, you know, adopting their production lines to make ventilators and sanitizer and masks and that sorts of thing? How are they donating their infrastructure for logistics and being able to transport and distribute these things? How are they contributing to clinical research? How are they working more collaboratively together to share technology and data? Again, Apple and Google came together to build a contact tracing app. Who would have thought that was possible? But it is. And that's part of the exciting thing of seeing how, even with our most, you know, virulent competitors, we can sometimes come together and build something faster than we could before. We're certainly seeing that in the drug world right now as we're trying to advance a vaccine. Again, taking measures to ensure that workers are employed and paid and insured and have the right resources they need to get their work done, helping customers get access to the products and financial assistance that they need and the information that they need. And doing something to really think about workflow and be more compassionate as people are trying to take on work from home, as well as teaching from home and caregiving from home, and just, you know, the kinds of schedules that we are being asked to keep now. So being much more aware of that, which gives us a huge opportunity as we move forward and move out of this and think about how we want to prevent inequality, right? We talk about having more diversity on our boards and in our teams, but it's also about designing and thinking about care, right? The burden often falls to women in this, both for childcare and for elder care, but also just, you know, thinking about in general how we build this more in. There's a conversation brewing right now about building a caring economics and thinking about that at the center of the productivity that we build. These things are not invisible anymore. It's also about really taking bold looks at things like universal basic income. Here in the United States, 9 cities, or I think 10 now, have banded together to do a more robust test of this and do a pilot in their communities. This has been tested all around the world, including throughout Europe, with a tremendous amount of, I think, success and certainly good learning around it, but it seems to be very encouraging early on. You know, I came across this concept 8 or 9 years ago. We talked to people about it and was told never would that happen. And here we are. So never say never. It's always important to say, what if? But it also raises questions, even if you don't go all the way to basic income, but think about transportation and healthcare and education and housing and, again, childcare. The idea that we will be able to deliver these things in different ways and technology-enabled ways. Right? If I can 3D print a house for $7,000, which currently is possible, that makes universal basic housing not seem so impossible. If we're trying to incentivize people to take more sustainable mobility options, maybe we shouldn't be charging them for that and offering those kinds of services for free. So just, the idea that we're open to different ways of holding each other as this society shifts and changes, and thinking about investing in upskilling and reskilling. Everyone will need to be reskilled for such a digital economy that will change this radically. What is our part? Who should shoulder that? You see companies like PwC investing $3 billion in upskilling, and not just for their own employees or for their clients, but also for those in municipal services, teachers and government workers, so that the idea is that not just some people get these skills, but hopefully everyone has access to these skills, so that we, again, don't continue to build this inequity, but we think about ways in which we can make it possible for all to be part of this economy moving forward. Which raises the last really interesting question when you think about the far horizon about where this is possible, and what will the future of work look like? Will it be a 4-day week? Will it be a shorter number of hours per day? Many companies are starting to experiment with that. Again, Microsoft did a test in Japan and saw when they went to a 4-day work week, it increased productivity by I think 40%. So we're starting to learn more about this, but we have this idea now that we can reinvent even a structure like that. We're no longer on an assembly line having to work for 8 hours a day to build the same widgets over and over again, right? We're being asked to be innovative and creative and collaborative. It's a different kind of work moving forward in this digital economy that we're heading into. So let's think about work in a very different way. These are all the things that are starting to shape the enterprise of the future. So we start to think again about what does the future need and expect of us, and what are you unique position to create and contribute to that as an individual, as an organization, as an industry, as a nation. What are some of the things that we see? So here's my cheat sheet a little bit for the future and in the shaping of the enterprise. Here's the daunting news. It will require that we pay attention to all of these things simultaneously, right? That we actively address climate stability and are part of the solutions, both in our own efforts and our enabling of our customers or the investments that we make. It's accelerating talent development and upskilling so everyone is a part of this digital economy. It's about addressing systemic biases and being very serious about them, and not just put Band-Aids on them, but really understand deeply and how long these things have been rooted. It's investing in digital transformation, which is the integration of tools into our work environments, but it's also about transforming business models and the way we create revenue, right? Just because we bring the tool in doesn't mean that it's the same way that business runs now. There's new and different ways in which we will create success, as we saw from that early BCG slide, that we will be need to transform the way that we create and deliver value, which means that we need to cultivate a more resilient and agile culture inside our organizations. How do we ensure that people feel ready to be part of that constant need for learning and that constant need for inventing? What are ways that we can build systems in to try things and to test things in a more successful way? And how do we challenge each other in a way in which we feel safe? How do we fortify the mental and emotional well-being of ourselves and our teams and of society overall? If we're going to go through this much change and require this much shift in how it is that we produce and what it is that we produce and how we see and how we feel that we're creating value, how do we ensure that we do that in a way in which we feel safe and that we feel encouraged to move forward and well supported? So again, it's a good time for another deep breath. Again, we should deep breathe often. We are not in just a moment of change. We're in an era of change. And as I said, if we can take care of ourselves at the center, we can handle chaos on the edge in more successful ways. So with that, I just say again, thank you so much for being part of, or including me as part of this experience. I'm excited to hear about the questions that this provokes. I'll leave you with one last thought about this idea of moving into the future and what we say is playing bigger, right? The future is literally being transformed and being designed right now by no one other than us. This is our future to shape. And as we do so, we're invited to play really big. And this comes from this line from Marianne Williamson that I was exposed to about 25 years ago that shaped my whole world, which is an acknowledgement that our playing small doesn't serve the world. We are here to play big. And to play big, again, means with courage and with compassion and with each other, more collaboratively, but really thinking about what is the biggest, boldest, most extraordinary vision that I want to create for this future. What is the future that I want to build? So again, thank you so much for playing big. Thanks for being part of this event, and thank you for including me. I feel very, very fortunate to have been a part of this, even from a distance. And I hope that in the future I get to be there in person. Thank you all so much and have a great day and a great conversation. Bye.